How many of y'all watch game shows? Really? Okay, yeah. It's a lot harder to do now because it used to be that the morning schedule was full of different game shows, and anymore it's all talk shows and whatnot. There's not as many game shows. If Satan were a game show host, though, I think that he would be Monty Hall from Let's Make a Deal. How many of y'all have seen Let's Make a Deal? Okay, the original. Now, Wayne Brady's doing a remake now, but back in the day, it was Monty Hall. If you never watched Let's Make a Deal with Monty Hall, then I'll tell you that it was a popular game show in which, back in the 1970s, where contestants were given the choice of 3 prizes, each of which was hidden behind a door or a curtain or in a box. The contestant got to pick one of those prizes, sight unseen, so they didn't know what they were getting. And then Monty Hall would offer them cash for their prize, and they had to decide either to take the money or the prize. Now, choose well, and you could walk away with $500 or even a new car, but choose poorly, and you might end up trading that $500 for, well, a folding lawn chair or an old used bicycle. Now, I'm not saying that Monty Hall was satanic, just that in his ability to be crafty in making deals, this biblical character of Satan was very Monty Hall-ish, or Monty Hall-like. In our New Testament passage this morning, Satan is trying to make a deal with Jesus, offering him comfort and power and the chance to prove his identity if he will just reject who and what God has called him to be. But Luke tells us that Jesus would not bite. Though Jesus did not accept any of Satan's offers, the idea of making a deal with the devil is one that has held the imagination of writers and artists ever since. There have been hundreds of books and movies and songs and pieces of art that are devoted to the theme of the legendary deal with the devil. One of the earliest is the old story of Dr. Faust, who, according to legend, made a deal with Satan that in exchange for wisdom and Satan's supernatural help, Dr. Faust would give up his soul at the end of a 24-year period. Satan kept his end of the bargain, and Dr. Faust became well known for his intellect and success. But at the end of those 24 years, Satan returned as promised to collect his soul. And that theme has been repeated throughout literature and the arts in a number of different forms. The Broadway musical Damn Yankees tells the story of an older man who makes a deal with the devil to exchange his soul for a successful baseball career. The character of Tommy Johnson in the movie Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? Claimed to have sold his soul to the devil in exchange for becoming a great blues guitarist. The Charlie Daniels Band scored a hit in 1979 with a song entitled The Devil Went Down to Georgia, in which a young man is challenged by Satan to a violin duel. I'll bet a fiddle of gold against your soul that says I'm better than you. Satan loses, of course. But one of my favorites is an episode of The Simpsons in which Homer sells his soul to Satan for a jelly donut. When the devil, played by Ned Flanders, comes to collect his due, Marge protests, arguing that when they were married, Homer had pledged his eternal soul to her. Therefore, he could not legally trade away that which did not belong to him in the first place. A jury of notorious historical figures like Benedict Arnold and Blackbeard the Pirate and the starting lineup of the 1976 Philadelphia Flyers sides with Marge, and the devil loses again. But can you really sell your soul to Satan or to anyone else, for that matter? Well, University of Iowa professor Kim Brew McLeod once sold his soul on eBay as a form of social commentary and was paid $1,325 for it. That's not a joke. It was reported in a number of mainstream news sources, including the Boston Herald, and you can Google it even today and still find lots of references to it. There were 30 bidders for his soul, and the winner received a deed to the soul and a 4-ounce jar, which presumably contained the soul. But this was not the first time that Mr. McLeod sold his soul either. When he was in high school, he sold 100 copies of his soul for $4.95 as a fundraiser to help pay for his senior prom. Which brings us back to that question, can you really sell your own soul? Well, literally, no. But figuratively, oh yes, you can, and we do it all the time. Now, I asked my wife, Mary, what does it mean to sell your soul? And she said, instant gratification. What do you mean, instant gratification, I asked. She looked up at me and sort of rolled her eyes and sighed like she was explaining this to a 4-year-old. I mean, she said, that selling your soul is a metaphor for trading in your principles and values, the things that you believe in, for instant gratification. It means taking the easy way out. It means focusing only on how your actions affect you and losing sight of the big picture. In short, it means giving in to temptation. Oh, I said, I think I understand now. And since I thought you all would appreciate me being more academically stringent in my research than just asking my wife over the dinner table, I consulted Fred Craddock, who's a professor at Candler School of Theology in Atlanta, and his commentary on Luke, in which he writes, "A real temptation beckons us to do that about which much good can be said. We are rarely tempted to sell our souls in exchange for pain and hardship. A real temptation is an offer not to fall, but to rise. The serpent in Eden did not ask, 'Do you wish to be like the devil?' but rather, 'Do you wish to be like God?' Of course, temptation is hard to resist. After all, what self-respecting tempter would approach a person with offers of personal, domestic, or social ruin?" So my wife, the pastor, and Fred Craddock, the academic, agree about temptation and exchanging one's soul for instant gratification. Which got me to thinking about our scripture lessons for this week. Adam and Eve, when faced with temptation, gave in. They were quick to make a trade for what seemed at the time to be a better option. But the point of that story is not that they succumbed to the allure of tempting fruit and a slick-talking snake, but that they exchanged the life for which they had been created, one defined by fellowship and communion with God, for something that in the short term looked a lot better, but really wasn't. And in comparison, Luke's story is not just about Jesus resisting Satan's attempts to make a deal. That's how Christians have traditionally understood that story. Satan tried to tempt Jesus to sin, and Jesus resisted. But what did Satan want in the deal? In the shaping and telling of this story, Luke points out to us that what Satan wanted in exchange for instant gratification was for Jesus to reject the person that he had been created and called to be. Now, in the first 3 chapters of his gospel, Luke tells us in every way imaginable that Jesus is the Son of God. The angel Gabriel says it. John the Baptist uses the words of the prophet Isaiah to say it. The old man Simeon says it. The long genealogy at the beginning of Luke's gospel says it. And the very words of God say it. This man is the Son of God. But when Satan meets Jesus out in the wilderness, his first words to Jesus challenge that identity. If you are the Son of God. With that one little word, if, Satan tries to tempt Jesus into redefining what it means to be Son of God. If you are the Son of God, then you can turn stones to bread. You can reign as a worldly king over all the earth. You can fall and not be hurt. In his challenge to Jesus, we see who Satan is tempting Jesus to be. By Jesus' response to that temptation, Luke shows us exactly who Jesus really is. In the challenge to turn stones to bread, we see Jesus tempted to use the powers of heaven to satiate his own hunger, to make his own daily life easier and more comfortable. Not extravagantly so, mind you, just bread from stones. But this is not who Jesus was called to be. In the offer to worship Satan in exchange for worldly power, we see Jesus tempted to claim ultimate political power, and by that power, to force all nations of the world to conform to his will. But this is not who Jesus was called to be. In the dare to throw himself down from the temple, we see Jesus tempted to call upon the heavenly host to prevent him from coming to harm, even his own eventual capture and destruction at the hands of the Roman authorities. But this is not who Jesus was called to be. In rejecting the deals that Satan offers him, Jesus is effectively stating that his life will be defined not by self-gratification, not by taking the easy road, but by trusting in God. And that's important, because the things that Satan offers Jesus in this story were most likely things that Jesus was tempted by, not just one time in the wilderness, but many times over the course of his life and ministry. How many times did Jesus see someone hungry or in need of shelter or clothing? And how many times was Jesus himself cold and hungry? And yet there are very few recorded instances of Jesus using his power to perform miracles to reverse the socioeconomic situation in his world, and none of him using his power to improve his own lot in life, though he must have been tempted to do so. And how many times did Jesus witness the oppression and injustice brought about by the Roman Empire and by the wealthy and the powerful and by the religious authorities, and yet rarely, if ever, did Jesus use his power to perform miracles to change the political situation in his world, though he was probably tempted to do so? And how many times was Jesus tempted to opt out of a life which would end on a cross? In the Garden of Gethsemane, we are told that Jesus prayed, "If it be your will, let this cup pass from my hands." And most likely, that was not the only time that Jesus was tempted to use his power and position to call upon the angels to rescue him, but he didn't, because he trusted that God's long-term plan was better than short-term solutions and instant gratification. Rita Mae Brown once wrote, "Lead me not into temptation, I can find the way myself." But temptation is not just about standing in the kitchen in the middle of the night in your boxer shorts by the light of the refrigerator debating whether or not to eat that last chocolate cupcake. It's about standing in the wilderness and facing the truth about who we are and about who God has created us to be, and deciding if we want to accept that life or trade it for what's behind the curtain. And unfortunately, we make that trade 1,000 times over, usually without even realizing it. Every time we choose to reject the life to which God has called us in favor of a life of self-gratification, every time we turn away from God's path and set out on our own, we give in to temptation and we sell our souls a little bit more. You see, trusting God really means trusting that God's way is the best way for our lives. God's way is challenging and difficult, and there are lots of places along the journey where a shortcut would really make things easier. And that's what we call temptation. Those opportunities to ignore and forget or rationalize away the things that Jesus did and taught because, well, that didn't apply to me, or well, Jesus was a special case, or surely Jesus didn't mean that. Temptation is those opportunities to take the easy way and in doing so, trade God's way for something else. And we all face those temptations because, well, let's face it, God's way is hard. It's hard to let go of our own plans and trust in God's plan. It's hard to be humble when the world doesn't seem to respect humble people. It's hard to be yourself when your friends and peers seem to expect something else from you. It's hard to take time out of your busy schedule to spend with your family when you have deadlines to meet and bills to pay. It's hard to take time to visit when someone who needs you, when you don't feel comfortable being in a hospital or a nursing home. It's hard. It's hard to take the time to listen to someone who just needs to talk when you really don't want to sit and listen to what they have to say. It's hard to care for others when you feel like someone should be caring for you. It's hard to be in church or in Sunday school or at youth group or in a church committee meeting or working on a mission project when you have homework to do or when you have games to play or when you'd rather just be somewhere else. It's hard to love people who aren't like us, who don't look like us or think like us or believe like us. It's hard to do things God's way. And so we turn away from God 1,000 different times in 1,000 different ways, and every time we do, it's like we've sold our souls for a jelly donut. But the good news is that making a bad choice and trading our identities for instant gratification is not the end of our experience with God, because God is merciful and just and is willing to give us a clean start. But before we get to rush to mercy and forgiveness, this season of Lent invites us to slow down, spend some time considering the ways in which we have turned from God's path and sold our souls for instant gratification in an easier way. You know, temptation would be a whole lot easier to resist if it weren't so darn enticing. And following God would be a whole lot easier to do if it weren't so hard. But that's exactly what we are called to do because it's who we are. It's who we were created to be. Like the first man and woman in the garden, we were created to live in fellowship and communion with God and one another. And even though that life can be really hard sometimes, it's really a gift, not one to be wasted, not one to be thrown away, and not one to be traded for instant self-gratification, no matter how tempting that deal may appear to be. So to God be all honor, glory, power, and dominion in this world and in the world that is to come. Amen.